So the other thing we want to talk about, of course, is that you and I have been trying to make the case, I think, I have anyway, that liberals need to stand up for liberal principles. This is what I said on last week's show. Obviously, I got a lot of hate for it. But all I'm saying is that liberal principles like freedom of speech, freedom to practice any religion you want without fear of violence, freedom to leave a religion, equality for women, equality for minorities, including homosexuals. These are liberal principles that liberals applaud for, but then when you say in the Muslim world this is what's lacking, then they get upset.
Yeah. Well, liberals have really failed on the topic of theocracy. They'll criticize white theocracy. They'll criticize Christians. They'll still get agitated over the abortion clinic bombing that happened in 1984. But when you want to talk about the treatment of women and homosexuals and free thinkers and public intellectuals in the Muslim world, I would argue that liberals have failed us. And the crucial point of confusion, thank you.
Thank God you're here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the crucial point of confusion is that we have been sold this meme of Islamophobia, where every criticism of the doctrine of Islam gets conflated with bigotry toward Muslims as people.
Right.
And that is it's intellectually ridiculous. Even it gets
So hold on, are
racism.
you the person who understands the officially codified doctrine of Islam? You're the interpreter of that, so you can say, well, this is...
I'm actually well educated on this topic.
I'm asking you. So
I mean,
you're saying if I criticize you're saying that Islamophobia is not a real thing. That if you're critical of something...
Well, it's not a real thing when we do it.
Right.
Well, no,
it really isn't.
I'm not denying that certain people are bigoted against Muslims as people. And that's a problem.
Big of you.
But
why are you so hostile about this
Because
concept?
it's gross. It's racist.
It's not. But it's so not.
It's like saying
It's so not.
You're shifty Jew.
You're not listening
Absolutely
to
not.
what we are saying.
You guys are saying if you want to be liberals, believe in liberal principles like freedom of speech, like we are endowed by our forefathers with inalienable rights, like all men are created equal.
Ben, we have to be able to criticize bad ideas. And
of course we do. No liberal doesn't want to criticize bad ideas.
But Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas.
Jesus.
So we have
That's
ideas
just a
like
fact.
blasphemy.
It is
It's an ugly thing.
Apostasy.
It is.
One basic liberal
let me
principle
unpack
is
it.
tolerance.
Let me unpack it.
But not for intolerance.
No, of course not. But the picture you're painting is to some extent true, but is hugely incomplete. It is certainly true that plenty of fanatics and jihadis are Muslim, but the people who are standing up to them, Malala, incredible Muhammad Ali Dadak in Iran, in prison for 9 years for speaking up for Christians. A friend that I had in Pakistan who was shot this year, Rashid Rahman, for defending people accused of apostasy.
Nick,
Or how about the more than a billion people who aren't
Muslims
fanatical, who don't punish women, who just want to go to school?
There seems to be so little insight. And coming fresh out of my interview with Bill Maher, I can see this. I mean, there are people who have tweeted at me and written to me who heard in my discussion with Bill a horrifying expression of racist hatred, or are pretending to have heard such a thing. And this kind of judgment is again, echoed by the usual suspects on the left. I mean, that position is so crazy that I just don't know how to interact with it. So it's not an accident that people on the right can't see any way to interact with it. I mean, all I can say is that if I'm a bigot and a racist and a xenophobe, if that's how I appear to you, based on what I said on Real Time, what words are you going to use for the real bigots and racists and xenophobes?
But hopefully I'll be able to discuss it with him
because
at some point.
I can feel it in myself. I mean, the reason why I know, in the laboratory of my own mind, I can see this working. So if I didn't know enough about how wrong Trump was on issues of policy, I mean, insofar as he has any beliefs about policy,
Right.
But if I wasn't paying attention as much as I am to just how crazy the implications are for his statements about the economy and building a wall and deporting 12 million illegal aliens and all the rest. And I was just concerned about terrorism. And then I saw Clinton and Obama not making any sense in the aftermath of something like Orlando.
Yeah,
right?
can't say jihadism.
Never
or,
mentioning Islam.
Yeah.
And then defending that obscurantism with this just sanctimonious and bullying speech that now I'm thinking about Obama's speech once he was pushing back against the pressure he was getting to use the word radical Islam or the phrase radical Islam. If I just had that to go on, well, then I could see how you would vote for Trump, right? You got a guy who's at least naming the problem, right? And if I didn't see what was wrong with the let's keep all Muslims out of the country, right? I don't see how impractical and needlessly inflammatory that policy prescription is, and I just see. You can see the appeal of someone like Trump saying, like, you see what's happening in Belgium and Germany. That's not going to happen here, right? That appeal. Hillary Clinton has to be able to say that, right? She has to be able to acknowledge that what's going on in Europe is not perfect, right? That Belgium has a problem, right? And it's a problem of having now millions of people in their society, however they got there, who actually don't have an interest in sharing the values of the society, the liberal values of the society. Now, no one on earth should be more concerned about this than liberals and actually liberal Muslims who want to embrace liberal values. I mean, those are the people who should be all over this problem.
Right. So this is like we're so tolerant that we're tolerant of intolerance, and thus we will let people who would gladly kill us into the house.
Yeah. And there's at the margins, there's some room for that, as what we said about free speech in the beginning. I think you should criminalize certain kinds of Islamist or jihadist speech? No, I don't. I think you should. Someone like Anjem Choudary, the Islamist buffoon of the UK. I think he should be able to say whatever he wants, right? And we should be able to criticize the stupidity and divisiveness of his views. So blasphemy laws of any kind are not appropriate. I mean, that's not how you fight this. But so there is a kind of, our open societies have to be somewhat tolerant with just excruciatingly bad ideas, which target the openness of the society itself and cynically exploit it. And I'm gonna, it's like the KKK showing up in the middle of a black neighborhood, knowing they're going to be protected by the cops, right, and then just talking about, saying all these things that would put them at just intolerable risk, but for the fact that the cops are protecting them. So, I think we more or less have that right in our society. So, it still is important how we talk about these things. And they obviously think it's important because they're loath to use any honest terminology to talk about these things. They think it's so combustible that if you call a spade, you're going to basically win the war of ideas for ISIS, right? But we should just be clear about what that is actually suggesting. It's saying that there are some significant number of people, a non-trivial number of people in the Muslim community who, and whether they're thinking this is tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or tens of millions, I don't know, but certainly enough to worry about, who are just doctors and dentists and just coaching Little League, and they want to live the American dream or the European dream as much as anyone. These are people who are never going to do anything bad to anyone. But if you talk about this problem in a sufficiently polarizing way,
you might.
And in particular, if you admit that there's a link between Islamism and jihadism and specific doctrines within the religion of Islam, right? So there's a religious motivation to this extremist behavior. If you admit that, you are going to drive these peaceful, honest, trustworthy people into the arms of the theocrats. These are people who are actually going to go fight with ISIS, or they're going to, quote, self-radicalize and start, killing people at their office parties, or they're going to fund people who do, or look the other way when their cousin does it. They're not going to, they won't call the FBI knowing that their cousin's going to go off and kill a dozen people with his AR-15. That's what they're worried about. That's what they're saying they're worried about.
So that really is the soft bigotry of low expectations, right? Because they're saying these people are on such a tenuous thread, really.
Oh, yeah.
That if you just say this, you've coded it for them, and then here this comes. So that's why it's such virtue signaling with me for the left. It's like, in a lot of ways, you are the racist ones. You know, I don't want to throw that word out like that, but in a lot of ways, you're looking at it through the lens of the way the way you would purport everyone else to be racist.
Yeah.
You're viewing it that way.
Yeah, I mean, these are people are, as you said, so precariously tethered to civilization and its commitments that one wrong word and that just the mask comes off and you're in the presence of barbarians, right?
Yeah.
And this is a point that Ayaan Hirsi Ali has made for years, and over again in response to the Danish cartoon controversy. She was pointing out that the very same ministers in Western Europe who were condemning the cartoonists and condemning the papers for printing these cartoons were busy, locking up their embassies and removing their staff just in preparation for the barbarian onslaught that they knew was coming.
Right.
And meanwhile, they're saying that Islam is a peaceful religion and has been unfairly disparaged by these cartoonists. So it's it's either in this, I call it the narrative because people often say you don't want to confirm the narrative of ISIS. If we call this radical Islam, we're confirming the narrative of ISIS or jihadists generally, that this is a war between the West and Islam. But the narrative is either the most uncharitable and paranoid thing ever said about a community,
Right.
or it's true. Now, if it's the former, we should stop doing it. It's an awful thing to assume that your Muslim OBGYN is this close to just going berserk or supporting those who are going. I mean, just imagine what it would take for you to suddenly support an organization like ISIS that is not by virtue of collateral damage, not by accident, but is intentionally cutting the heads off of journalists and aid workers and burning them alive in cages and, crucifying children. I mean, this is what they're doing, again, not because of some failure of their technology, right? Or like they had bad information and they accidentally bombed Médecins Sans Frontières or something, as we did in Afghanistan.
In this video, we'll be talking about the work of Shireen Razak and the racialization of Muslims in Western liberal societies. Content warning for racism and gendered violence. The work of both Sheth and Razak fits into what's called post-colonial academia. That's where we say, okay, white European nations have a history of colonialism, slavery, genocide, and that has shaped the way the world is today. So let's do some philosophy or history or literature studies, whatever, and see if bearing that legacy in mind helps us discover anything interesting, both about that period of history and about now. Post-colonial philosophy is super interesting and super important right now because a lot of people are beginning to examine the legacy of colonialism in their own lives, from students in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign and challenging the predominance of white authors on reading lists to the Black Lives Matter movement. And despite some people saying this is millennials being oversensitive, generation snowflake, regressive left, victim culture, there is actually a significant and legitimate academic backdrop to this. So this is super relevant, super important, cutting-edge philosophy. Central to Shireen Razak's thesis is the idea of camps. Camps are zones in which it has been legally designated that normal law does not apply. Camps are sometimes literally camps, but they can also be a prison or Guantanamo Bay or a shipping container. In the history of slavery, black skin functioned like a camp. And camps can sometimes be designated officially by the law or by an unwritten rule that we just don't ask what goes on in there. It's best to think of camps not in terms of a binary, but as a spectrum. Sometimes they're built overnight, sometimes they're built a little bit of the law being changed at a time. Although they're increasingly normal in a post-9/11 world, camps are, of course, nothing new. You might notice strong parallels here to Sheth's ideas of making exceptions of people. Camps are a consequence of racialization, which we discussed in part 1. And I'll say one more time, you really need to understand racialization to understand this video. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. There's this big debate over whether race is a series of biological categories or whether it's just a social construct. And in her book, Toward a Political Philosophy of Race, Falguni Sheth tries to break away from that binary. She says that to talk about race just as a biological category ignores all the ways that it's used in politics and law, and to talk about it just as a social construct ignores the more interesting questions of who constructs it, why do they construct it, and how do they do it. Sheth thinks that the concept of race is a type of technology. It's a mental tool used by those in power, that's the who. They use it to manage unruly populations, that's the why, and they do this through racialization, that's the how. So let's go through it and I'll explain to you what all of that means. The technology of race is used by sovereign power. That's a term that Sheth borrows from Foucault, and for the purposes of this video we can take it to mean whoever is officially in charge and the systems through which their power is expressed. Sheth talks specifically about liberal societies. By liberal societies, she means societies with certain basic assumptions at their heart. For instance, a division between the public and the private spheres, an insistence that all citizens are equal, emphasis on the rule of law, where the law is thought to be fair and consented to democratically by the people. Liberalism also usually means capitalism, and since the tail end of the 20th century it's increasingly meant neoliberal capitalism, with an emphasis on low welfare, low taxes, and free markets. Sheth has a very interesting view of what sovereign power and its legal and political systems are for. She thinks that the purpose of the state is to conserve its own power, and by extension, conserve those basic liberal assumptions. The function of government is not to ensure peace or justice or fairness or anything like that. This is the self-preservation society. She thinks that there's a paradox at the heart of liberalism. Liberal societies will talk the talk of inclusiveness and universal human rights for everyone, even as they systemically exclude from that embrace certain groups of people. Think about how the founding fathers of the US preached liberty and justice for all whilst owning slaves. It's not always as stark as that, but Sheth says that the promise of liberalism is very rarely realized for everyone. But sovereign power has to preserve the basic liberal assumptions. So what does it do? It creates exceptions. It rules out certain groups of people as not being eligible for entrance into the promised land, as not being eligible for protection, benefits, voting rights, whatever. As a bonus, if a population is enslaved, or there's an unjust war, or a refugee crisis, or a financial crash, then those disasters can be written off as mistakes, as misapplications of the principles of liberalism. Because sovereign power can always say, oh, the exceptions that we made at the time looked legitimate, but in hindsight, they were actually errors. Anything but systemic problems. Okay, so we've said that the technology of race is used by sovereign power trying to preserve itself. We've covered the who, but preserve itself against what, exactly? Time to look at the why. Fortunately, this bit's pretty easy. Sovereign power wants to preserve itself against what Sheth calls the unruly. The unruly is that which is unpredictable, undependable, or threatening to a political order. Sovereign power does not make exceptions of people randomly. If your existence or the way you live threatens any of the basic liberal assumptions, or even, as is often the case, if it's just perceived as a threat to them, then you're in danger of being marked as unruly. So, for instance, if you openly display your private values in public, if you remind people that the law isn't always administered equally, if you actually need the welfare state in order to survive, then in the eyes of sovereign power, you can be a threat, whether they're consciously aware of that and whether you actually are or not. So sovereign power wants to preserve itself against perceived challenges from the unruly by making exceptions of people. It's time now to bring race back into this, tie all the threads together, and explain how making those exceptions works. Racialization is the process by which a population is divided, and one group is pushed further and further away from that promise of liberalism, both in the law and in the minds of the people. It is, quote, the process of delineating a population in contrast to a dominant population and a corresponding political tension. It is how sovereign power creates exceptions to its own rules and makes those exceptions seem totally legitimate and natural. Racialization protects sovereign power and suppresses the unruly because there's an implied threat of violence for those who can't get into the promised land. If you're in the group that's racialized and pushed out and you don't get the protection or the benefits or whatever it is, well then that'd be bad for you, wouldn't it? So you better stop being unruly and toe the line. Let's say that you and I represent sovereign power, and there's this group of people that we think are unruly and we want to racialize them. In order to do that, we first need two things. They need to have some distinguishing feature that we can use to point them out to the dominant population and say, look, there's the enemy. It could be a physical thing, like their skin color, but it might not. It could be their religion or their socioeconomic status or their sexuality. If they don't have a distinguishing feature, then we could always try giving them one, like for instance, making them wear a yellow star or a red wristband. They also need to be vulnerable already compared to the dominant population, otherwise it's going to be very difficult for us to racialize and push them out. Maybe there's some historical inequality that hasn't been rectified, maybe they're not represented in positions of power, maybe they're new immigrants to our nation and they need our help to survive. We take their perceived unruliness and we say, everybody with that distinguishing feature is like that. And that's how we write them all off as bad and begin to justify excluding them from society as a race that we have effectively just created. Now, this bit is the hardest bit to understand. The distinguishing features then become the criteria by which sovereign power tells us it's making the distinction. It's actually distinguishing on the basis of unruliness, but it's disguising that as a neutral, objective, possibly biological category. Think about the lengths that the Nazis went to prove that Aryans were a different race from Jews or Poles or whoever they wanted rid of at the time. It's politics disguising itself as neutral, objective science. Scheff thinks that physiological markers like skin color and genetics don't constitute race. Rather, those features are used to point out populations that are already being racialized and pushed out because sovereign power perceives them as unruly. That's why some biological differences like skin color are thought to constitute race, and some biological differences like hair and eye color are just natural variation within a race. Because the rules for deploying the concept of race don't come from biology, they come from power. All this theory might seem a bit abstract, so let's look at a concrete example. Consider the internment of Japanese Americans in the USA just prior to World War II. Many so-called Japanese Americans were actually American citizens, second or third generation descendants of Japanese immigrants. They could be distinguished on sight from the dominant white population. Their ancestors had faced obstacles like the Alien Land Law and laws against mixed marriages, so compared to the white population they were already vulnerable. When the war started, the US government worried that they might rise up and commit mass sabotage. That was the perceived unruliness. And so, on President Roosevelt's orders, 120,000 people had their ordinary rights suspended and were imprisoned in concentration camps. The state took a bunch of people who were in their eyes potentially unruly, drew a line around them, said everybody within that line is the same in terms of their threat to us, regardless of how much individual evidence we may have for their cases, and used that line as an excuse to literally lock them up. So to sum up, the concept of race functions as technology in a threefold way. Firstly, it classifies people according to their perceived unruliness. Secondly, it disguises that classification under criteria that are politically neutral, like skin color. And finally, it hides the true relationship of violence between citizens and sovereign power. Scheff's model of race is neither biological category nor social construct. Rather, race latches onto certain observable variations in humans, sometimes biological, sometimes not, and attaches socio-political importance to them in order to preserve power. And this might actually explain a lot. Racialization appears to justify the need for camps by making the target population seem unsuited to existing outside of one. So, armed with these concepts, we can now look at how racialization begins to construct camps around Muslim bodies. Laws about detention and immigration are good places to start. As a consequence of the US Patriot Act and laws like it, would-be Muslim immigrants have been detained on the grounds that they might commit terrorism, which comes with the suspension of their normal rights to open, fair trials and the like. Razak focuses particularly on Canadian legal cases because that's where she teaches. Normally, somebody would be detained if they had done something wrong or if you had definite evidence that they were going to. But in the cases she examines, and the thousands like them, Muslims are detained without that kind of evidence and without what would normally be called due process. So we're dividing the population, making exceptions for one particular group to the normal rules, and pushing them further away from the protection of the state. Consider also the practice of profiling. Where you've been, who you've associated with, where you've recently travelled. What would only be circumstantial evidence in someone else's case can be damning in a Muslim's. Razak calls this sleeper cell logic, the idea that all Muslims might be a threat because they're Muslim, no matter how much evidence you might have for that in an individual case. Big parallel to the internment of Japanese Americans that we discussed in part 1. What all these examples feed into is what Razak calls the culture clash narrative. The idea that Islam is fundamentally different from and incompatible with, quote, Western values, and therefore that it must be eradicated. Not only is this an obvious example of racialization in action, but it's also a colonial way of thinking. The culture clash narrative can be used to justify feelings of superiority in the dominant culture, and therefore be used to justify aggressive, imperialist policies and crimes. We see this narrative being spun when Islam is referred to as barbaric, irrational, or medieval. The language of rationality has long been used to mark out certain groups as incapable of being reached by anything but violence, located in a pre-modern, uncivilized state from which we, the modern civilized people, must liberate them, and where, crucially, that liberation will take place on our terms, not theirs. If you've read any Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins and many other people, you might recognize some of these themes. What all this gets at is the control of the unruly that we talked about in part 1. If you're in the group that's racialized and pushed out, well, that'd be bad for you, so better stop being unruly and toe the line. Better be one of the good Muslims who does what they're told, doesn't speak up about any systemic injustices they might suffer, and doesn't criticize sovereign power. And if you're constantly being asked to reaffirm your loyalty because you're constantly under suspicion, then there's less room for you to go, you know what, obviously ISIS are a bunch of assholes, but at the same time, I don't think my government's foreign policy in Syria is the right way to go. Because if you do, this is what happens. Muslims are cast out of a whole range of political positions that other citizens can publicly occupy much more easily. The special measures that single out Muslims for detention and attention are racializing because they say that all the means for governance we have, the law, due process, our rights, those are for us. They do not work on you, and therefore they do not apply to you, because you are fundamentally different, dangerous, savage.
I took the top 5 things that I think people attack you on, in my opinion, misquote you on, and I thought maybe we could take 5 minutes for each one, 5 or 6 minutes for each one, and that way, each time someone says, well, Sam Harris wants to nuke the Middle East, or Sam Harris wants to racially profile Muslims, or whatever it is, you or I or anyone that's clear-minded can just send a link and say, here it is in 5 minutes. You don't have to read a book. You don't have to watch a 3-hour interview. Here it is. I think the number one thing that people say about you is that when you say Islam, you mean all Muslims.
Right, right.
So take it away.
Yeah, so the claim is that I generalize about Muslims, and this is incredibly ironic because half the time in that Bill Maher clip was spent where I was talking about statistics and poll results and percentages, and a certain percentage is jihadist, and then there's a wider circle of Islamists, and then there's a wider circle of conservatives, and so I never generalize about the Muslim world. And insofar as we
have good data on the numbers of people who subscribe to various beliefs, then I'm always looking at those data. And so, and everything I say about the problem of Islam and Islamism takes as its area of concern, first and foremost, the people living in the Muslim world who are living under the shadow of, if not the boot of theocracy. So, women and gays and freethinkers and public intellectuals and atheists, people who email me saying they're afraid their mother and father will kill them if they knew they were an atheist, for instance. And there's nobody who I celebrate more than Muslim apostates and true reformist Muslims, like my co-author on this new book, Maajid Nawaz, who have taken just heroic risks to say critical things about the faith in a context where it's much more dangerous to do so than the context in where you and I live. And I mean, so if I were a Muslim in Pakistan saying half of what I'm saying on this show, I would have a life expectancy of about 5 hours.
Right.
And that is a political and human rights reality that every liberal who's using this term Islamophobia is disregarding, not at their peril, at the peril of all the people who are not being helped by Westerners who could help, and non-Muslims who could help. And what non-Muslims can do is help in whatever way possible to make criticism of theocracy in the Muslim world safe to do. So yeah, no, I don't generalize, and I think, of course, there are millions and millions of Muslims who do not take the barbaric passages in the Quran and the Hadith seriously, and who are not wanting to kill apostates and don't want to throw gays from rooftops. And those are not the people I'm talking about. I mean, or if I'm ever talking about them in my criticism of religion, I'm talking about them in the same spirit that I talk about, Reform Jews or non-doctrinaire Christians who are not a real threat to anybody, but who may be bending public policy around in ways we don't like.
Sure.
The problem with many of those Muslims is they don't want their religion criticized at all, and they don't want any link between its core tenets around jihad and paradise and martyrdom, spelled out with in terms of the way it's generating the kinds of violence and intolerance we're seeing in the world today. So, insofar, if you're going to defend your religion by saying Islam is a religion of peace and the Islamic State has nothing to do with Islam, you're being intellectually dishonest, and that kind of denial of obvious realities now is, I think, irresponsible and dangerous.
Yeah.
Just to close the door to notions of racism and bigotry against Muslims as people. I mean, I think the apostates, the intellectuals, the women, the gays of the Muslim world are the most important people in the world right now. If we could give green cards to every real secularist in the Muslim world, I think they should just get to the front of the line. I mean, these are the people who need to be empowered, and so that's. I mean, the irony is that they, if they could leave the Muslim world, the Muslim world needs them, right? So I mean, the best thing to do would be to empower them in the Muslim world. But
right.
I mean, I think, life for these people is. In countries like Pakistan and we have Bangladeshi bloggers being murdered, in public by machete-wielding maniacs, and nothing happens, right? Everything I say about Islam is a confession of solidarity with these people, and so how you get racism out of that or bigotry against Muslims as people, that's you're a better geometer than I.
And I just see, hordes of people streaming into Europe unvetted, and I see Britain breaking off, partially in response. And I don't see any liberal politician who will even admit that Europe has a problem.
Yeah.
Right? There's, women are being raped and groped in Copenhagen, and the stories are being buried, and it's.
But all civilization is equal, Sam.
Yeah, but it's like the immolation of a civilization, right?
Right.
And yet we have it's taboo to talk about it. So
This is why I've begun to use the phrase the new center. I think we need a new center to our politics. I mean, I don't know how you ever get the people writing for The Intercept or the people on the Young Turks to be reasonable human beings, given what they've done in recent years. And so that's the left, as it currently stands. Of course, it's no accident that the Women's March, which otherwise seemed like a great thing, was vitiated by its alliance with Linda Sarsour and these closeted and semi-closeted Islamists who have co-opted the women's movement and convinced millions of women, apparently, that the hijab is a sign of women's empowerment. That's fairly mind-boggling. Just so there's no confusion on this point, I think you, dear listener, should be free to wear the hijab if you want to, but you should also recognize that most women the world over who are veiled to one or another degree are living that way, not out of choice, or certainly not out of what could be considered a free choice. They're living in the context of a community that will treat them like whores or worse if they don't veil themselves, right? That's not the political empowerment of women. And someone like Linda Sarsour, again, one of the principal organizers of the Women's March, is a theocrat who lies about this, who attacks Ayaan Hirsi Ali. This is how the left will die, by, on the basis of its own moral relativism, locking arms with Islamism and stealth theocracy, which is what it has done.
Razak says we also see the racialization of Muslims in the way that we respond to patriarchal violence in Muslim families and communities within our own nations. Take so-called honor killings. When the media and politicians talk about these, they talk about them as if they have only Muslim causes. The wrongness is located in Islam, the, quotes, culture that supposedly promotes these killings. Contrast that to the way we talk about white women who are murdered for leaving abusive relationships. There, the wrongness is located most often in the individual murderer. Honor killings are sequestered in their own little zone and not usually talked about as an example of the violence that faces women everywhere as a result of patriarchy. Razak says again, we're feeding the culture clash narrative, making exceptions of one group of people. When we look at a woman wearing a veil and see her as automatically oppressed and in need of liberation without giving her a voice in that discussion, we again racialize Muslims as a pre-modern, uncivilized people. And we also erase the agency of Muslim women who choose to wear the veil for a variety of religious and other reasons. The real liberation is Muslim women choosing for themselves what to wear, whether that's a veil or not. When we talk about forced marriages, we don't talk about the way that systemic racism drives communities into themselves to seek rejuvenation by making young people marry people from similar backgrounds. And we don't talk about the way that our immigration system can cut communities off and leave people to try and exploit loopholes that are there for spouses. Again, like with terrorism, these issues are talked about as if there is no background context that the West has the power to affect. In particular, Razak says, we ignore the role that colonialism played in popularizing conservative religious interpretations in the first place. Razak says it's also telling that when it comes to Muslim women being victims of violence, we focus on three things: female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and honor killings. But we don't talk so much about the comparatively more widespread violence of the wars that Western countries wage, or the economic and educational systems that keep wider groups of people, including Muslim women, down. Because, of course, those things are systemic to us and not as easy to write off as a Muslim thing. Razak writes, the body of the Muslim woman, a body fixed in the Western imaginary as confined, mutilated, and sometimes murdered in the name of culture, serves to reinforce the threat that the Muslim man is said to pose to the West, and is used to justify the extraordinary measures of violence and surveillance required to discipline him and Muslim communities. It is virtually impossible to name and confront the violence that Muslim women, like all women, experience at the hands of their men and families without providing ideological fuel to the, quotes, war on terror. Nevertheless, Patriarchy must be confronted, especially when it's violent. Razak is not saying that we need to just forget about these issues. We need to address them, but we need to find a way of doing it that doesn't justify racism and imperialism. Her proposed solutions involve seeing the communities where this kind of patriarchy takes place not as uninvited immigrant guests, but as people displaced by colonialism and under considerable social and economic pressure, where attempts to control those within the group will be stringent as a result of those conditions. The real solutions involve giving women in those communities more options to seek help in a way that suits them, like shelters, housing, education, safe spaces for women, better trained service providers, you know, the things that make it easier for everyone to live. So, since this is the question I know some of you will have clicked on this video for, can you be racist towards Muslims? If Sheff and Razak are right about racialization, then yes, you can, because the distinguishing feature required to begin racialization could, in the right historical context, be skin color or religion or gender identity even, if history was the right way, because race comes from power, as we discussed in part 1. And whether or not you want to attach that label to it, the practice of making exceptions for Muslims in the law and in the minds of the people is a worrying trend in all the ways that Razak has observed, and maybe you can think of some other ways in which Muslims are made exceptions of. Some people will tell you that you can't be racist towards Muslims because Islam is a religion, not a race. As we've seen over these two videos, that presupposes a certain definition of the word race, which it is possible to argue against. As I explained in part 1, quoting the dictionary would be begging the question. Does this mean that the doctrines of Islam should never be criticized, or that the actions of groups for whom Islam is an ideological pillar should never be criticized? No, it doesn't mean that. That's a straw man used by people who like to throw around the term regressive left. But an awareness of how these systems of power function, their history, their legacy, and who they really serve, will help us do that in a way that doesn't inadvertently do more harm than good. In particular, seeking out the voices of Muslims themselves who are aware of how these systems of power function and have lived experience under them will help us do that in a way that keeps the ghost of colonialism at bay. Razak says that for those of us who live in countries that are rich and powerful in part because of our ancestors' colonialism, we are called to find our identities through oppressing and excluding an other. There's an old racist slogan in my country, "There ain't no black in the Union Jack." And people who use that can't define Britishness except in terms of excluding somebody else. A little bit like how toxic masculinity calls men to find manliness only by oppressing women. We define ourselves as rational and civilized by being in conflict with uncivilized and irrational enemies. And sovereign power will create those enemies to serve its own agenda. In this way, we justify our position of global dominance to ourselves, and that stops us from critically examining our own behavior, both on the personal and on the national level. And it stops us seeing the true complexity of politics, economics, international relations, terrorism studies, and philosophy.